All right, welcome in everyone to another deep dive here. Today we're looking at something pretty important, I think really crucial, and that's how autism can present differently in girls.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a lot of, we got some great material to dig into today.
Yeah, some really fascinating stuff.
That really helps explain, why this is something that often gets missed
Yeah.
and what you should really be looking out for.
I think it's really important to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Our understanding of autism has historically been shaped by boys, by observing boys.
Right.
And so much of the sort of diagnostic criteria and just our general understanding of how autism presents has been based on that.
Yeah.
And what's so important about this deep dive, I think, is it illuminates the ways that autism can manifest differently in girls.
Yeah.
And that's leading to some girls being missed, being diagnosed late, and therefore not getting the support that they really need.
Exactly. And that's what we're really here to do today is give you sort of a clearer lens to understand autism in girls and highlight some of these more subtle cues, the nuances that, maybe will resonate with you, whether you're thinking about yourself or someone you know.
Yeah. And what the sources we've looked at make really clear is that underdiagnosis is a really significant issue.
Yeah.
And one of the key reasons for that is the way girls navigate social situations, which is often masking those underlying challenges they're facing.
So let's start unpacking that underdiagnosis then. The material talks a lot about social camouflaging.
Right.
What does that practically look like?
So it's fascinating. What we're talking about here is this really active and often conscious effort that many girls put into observing and then mimicking social behaviors.
Wow.
So they're like astute observers of their peers.
Yeah.
They're noting how people interact, learning kind of the expected responses, and then they're strategically trying to replicate those.
Yeah.
It's a real effort to sit in, but it takes a huge amount of energy.
Yeah.
And it can completely obscure the fact that they're not intuitively grasping those social dynamics.
It's like they're learning a script for social interaction without
exactly.
necessarily understanding underlying meaning.
Exactly.
I mean, that's such a powerful image. And then you have this difference in special interests as well.
Right, precisely. So when we think about that sort of intense focus that is sometimes associated with autism, we often picture interests like trains or very specific video games.
Yeah.
And these tend to be more commonly observed in boys.
Yeah.
But girls certainly develop intense interests as well, but they might be drawn to things like animals. Or specific book series, or even celebrities.
Yeah.
Now here's a crucial point, because these interests often align with societal expectations of girls, the intensity and the narrow focus,
Right.
which is a hallmark of autistic special interest. It might not be recognized as significant.
Interesting.
Right. So think about it. A deep dive into the intricacies of horse breeds, spending hours researching and cataloging them might be seen as just a phase rather than the same level of focused intensity that we'd recognize in a boy detailing every engine type of a train.
Yeah, on the surface. Loving a particular singer or being really into a certain animal doesn't immediately suggest the same depth of focus that knowing every single fact about space might.
Exactly.
And even the way repetitive behaviors show up can be different.
Right. And so this raises a really important question about how we actually define and look for these behaviors. Because in boys, they might be more outwardly visible. Right. So things like hand flapping, lining up toys in very precise ways.
Right.
But the sources suggest that in girls, these behaviors can be much more subtle. So it might be playing with their hair in a very specific pattern, repetitive doodling. That seems almost unconscious, or fidgeting with small objects in a way that easily goes unnoticed.
Right.
So it's the underlying need for that repetition, that sense of sameness and comfort that's key.
Yeah.
But the outward expression can be remarkably different.
And sadly, this subtlety seems to feed into another problem, which is misdiagnosis.
Right. Yes.
The sources highlight that girls are sometimes being diagnosed with conditions like anxiety, depression, or even ADHD before anyone even considers autism.
And that's a really critical point to understand, because The challenges in social situations
Mm-hmm.
might manifest as social anxiety, or
Yeah.
the difficulties with focus and organization could be misinterpreted as ADHD. So it really underscores the urgent need for a more nuanced understanding of how autism presents
Across genders.
to avoid these initial misdiagnoses and the subsequent delays in getting the right kind of support.
So we're starting to see some key reasons why girls are often missed here.
Yeah.
So let's delve deeper into some of the key signs, starting with social and communication differences.
Right.
The sources mention a preference for solitary play or maybe just one very close friend over larger groups.
And it's fascinating here. It's not necessarily about a dislike of other people. Often these girls have a deep desire for connection, but navigating the sheer complexity of larger social groups can feel incredibly overwhelming. So one-on-one friendships allow for a more controlled and predictable dynamic.
Which can feel much safer and less taxing.
Yeah, that really resonates. What about those tricky social cues that most of us just kind of take for granted, like tone of voice,
Right.
sarcasm, facial expression? This is often a core area of difficulty, Interpreting these subtle, unspoken forms of communication isn't always intuitive.
Right.
So a sarcastic remark might be taken completely literally, or a slight change in facial expression or tone might go entirely unnoticed, and that can lead to misunderstandings and feelings of social awkwardness or isolation.
Yeah, and that tendency towards shyness or withdrawal, especially in new or unfamiliar environments. Do you think that could be directly linked to this difficulty in reading the room, so to speak?
Absolutely, because navigating a new social environment requires a huge amount of processing of all those unwritten social rules and cues, So for someone who finds that inherently challenging, the natural response can often be to withdraw as a way to kind of manage that potential for overload and missteps.
The sources also touch on communication itself.
Yes.
Difficulties in initiating conversations or keeping them going.
Yeah, and this can show up in different ways. Some girls might be quieter, struggling to find an entry point into a conversation or feeling unsure how to keep it flowing naturally. On the other hand, others might be very talkative, but their conversation might be heavily focused on a single intense interest. And they might not always readily notice if the other person isn't equally engaged in that specific topic.
So it's not just about how much someone talks, but really about what they're talking about and whether it's a truly reciprocal exchange.
Exactly.
And then the idea of using scripts or memorized phrases in conversation, that's another really interesting point.
That goes back to that idea of social camouflaging we discussed earlier, so girls might consciously learn and then use specific phrases or responses that they've observed being used effectively in social situations, almost like having a mental playbook of conversation snippets. Right. And while this can be a helpful strategy for navigating interactions, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a deep intuitive understanding of the underlying social dynamics at play.
Okay, let's move on to emotional and behavioral patterns.
Okay.
The sources really highlight sensory overload.
Right.
This is something we hear about a lot in the context of autism generally, but what might it look like specifically for girls?
Well, it's really important to understand that sensory sensitivities can be incredibly individual, but there are some common triggers. And these can include things like loud or sudden noises, bright or flickering lights, and the way certain fabrics feel against the skin. And for girls, this sensory overload might lead to the same kind of intense reactions, meltdowns or shutdowns. But they might also be more likely to try and mask their discomfort or overwhelm in public, which can lead to significant internal distress and exhaustion.
So how do changes in routine or unexpected events typically impact girls with autism?
Well, predictability and structure are often incredibly important for providing that sense of safety and security. So unexpected changes, even seemingly small ones, can be profoundly disruptive and cause significant anxiety. Girls might develop very specific routines for their day. And even minor deviations from those established patterns can be very distressing and difficult to manage.
The sources also mention this potential for strong emotional reactions, but perhaps those being hidden or internalized.
Right.
In public settings, which seems very connected to the idea of camouflaging.
Exactly. They might learn to suppress outward displays of intense emotions in social situations as a way to fit in or avoid drawing unwanted attention. But internally, they could be experiencing a significant amount of emotional turmoil. And this can lead to feelings of being constantly on guard, misunderstood, or simply emotionally overwhelmed beneath the surface.
And those more subtle repetitive behaviors we talked about earlier, like perhaps rocking gently or fidgeting quietly, these can also be a way for girls to self-soothe.
Absolutely. Or manage overwhelming sensory input or emotional distress, right? So these behaviors can serve a really crucial regulatory function, helping them to cope with sensory overload, anxiety, or other forms of emotional distress. And the fact that they might be performed more privately often underscores that conscious effort to fit in with social norms.
Finally, on the emotional side,
the
sources note the experience of intense emotions and potential difficulties with self-regulation. That sounds like a really significant challenge.
The intensity of emotions experienced can often be heightened and developing the skills to effectively manage and express those emotions in healthy and socially appropriate ways can take more time and focused support and understanding. And this can sometimes contribute to those initial misdiagnoses we discussed, like anxiety or mood disorders.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about special interests and intellectual patterns. We've touched on the nature of the interests themselves, but what about the actual depth of that passion?
Well, the key thing to recognize here is the level of detail and the sheer intensity of the focus. These aren't just casual hobbies. They can become truly all-consuming passions where the individual develops an almost encyclopedic level of knowledge. And even if the topic of interest seems relatively socially acceptable, the sheer intensity and the narrow, unwavering focus can be a really significant indicator.
And there's a really interesting point in the sources about excelling academically in some very specific areas, but simultaneously struggling with what are called executive function skills.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on what that might look like?
Yeah, so think of executive function as the brain's management system. It encompasses things like organization, planning, time management, the ability to initiate and complete tasks. And for girls with autism, even if they demonstrate strong abilities in say, memorizing historical facts or understanding complex scientific concepts, areas that might align with their intense interests or involve rote learning, they might still face significant challenges with the everyday practicalities of school or work, such as, planning a long-term project, organizing their notes and materials, or managing their time effectively to meet deadlines. So these are the kinds of everyday challenges that fall under that umbrella of executive function.
That really clarifies things. Intense focus on a specific subject might come naturally, but the broader organizational skills needed to navigate the demands of school or a job can be a completely different ballgame. The sources also mentioned perfectionist tendencies, and a significant fear of failure.
And this can often stem from a really strong internal desire to get things right and a heightened sensitivity to criticism or perceived mistakes, and the added pressure of constantly trying to mask autistic traits and fit in socially can also contribute to this perfectionism. Because any misstep might feel particularly exposing or like a failure of their camouflaging efforts.
Lastly, let's dive a bit deeper into sensory sensitivities. We've touched on a few examples, but could you paint a more comprehensive picture of what these can entail?
Certainly. So sensitivities to textures can be can be incredibly specific and,
Yeah.
and impactful. Certain fabrics might feel intensely itchy or uncomfortable. The texture of particular foods can be highly aversive. Beyond that, strong or unusual smells can be overwhelming. Bright or flickering lights can be visually distressing.
Yeah.
And loud or sudden sounds can be physically painful or incredibly anxiety inducing.
And it's not just about actively avoiding certain sensory inputs.
That's right.
The sources also discuss sensory seeking behaviors. What are some examples of that?
Yeah. So some individuals might actively seek out certain types of sensory experiences. And this could manifest as, enjoying spinning, rocking back and forth, jumping, engaging in repetitive movements like hand flapping or stimming with objects, when they're feeling excited or overwhelmed. So these behaviors can be a way to self-stimulate, regulate their internal state or process sensory information.
The sources also make this fascinating point about a potential duality when it comes to the perception of pain, either a surprisingly high tolerance or an extreme sensitivity to even minor discomfort.
Yeah, and this really highlights the variability in sensory processing that we see in autism.
Yeah.
So some individuals might have a noticeably higher threshold for pain than what might be expected, while others might experience even relatively minor physical discomfort with a much greater intensity. And this obviously can have important implications for medical care.
Yeah.
And for understanding their overall physical experiences.
This has been incredibly insightful in truly understanding, the often subtle nuances of how autism can present in girls. It really underscores why recognizing these signs matters so profoundly.
Absolutely. It's so much more than just getting a label, isn't it? As the sources emphasize. Accurately recognizing these signs often leads to earlier diagnosis, which in turn unlocks access to really crucial support systems that can make a significant difference in a girl's life.
And what kind of specific resources are we talking about here?
Well, this could include things like social skills training. That is specifically tailored to address the unique social navigation challenges that girls with autism might face. Creating sensory-friendly environments both at home and in school is often vital. Therapy can be incredibly helpful for emotional regulation and managing any co-occurring anxiety or depression, and importantly, appropriate accommodations in educational settings and later in the workplace can make a huge difference in their ability to thrive.
It sounds like that early diagnosis isn't just about getting access to help, but also about something even more fundamental, fostering self-understanding.
Absolutely, and self-acceptance.
Yeah.
Receiving an accurate diagnosis can provide a crucial framework for understanding their own unique experiences and challenges, and it can be incredibly validating, helping them to make sense of feelings and reactions they might have struggled with for years. Without explanation. So this understanding, coupled with the right support and a greater sense of self-acceptance, can significantly improve their overall well-being and empower them to lead more fulfilling lives.
So to bring all of this really important information together, the key takeaway for you, our listener, is that autism in girls often presents in ways that can look quite different from what we traditionally expect. It's so often shaped by factors like active social camouflaging and the potentially subtle ways that interests and behaviors might be expressed.
Precisely. We absolutely need to broaden our collective understanding and move beyond those long-standing, often stereotypical ideas of what autism looks like and really recognize the often understated ways it can manifest
In girls.
And for you, our listener, perhaps this deep dive